You are 8 years old, walking through the dusty streets of Dongola in 1597 AD, when rough hands seize you from behind. The last thing you remember of freedom is your mother's scream echoing across the Nile, as slave traders drag you toward wooden cages that smell of despair and human waste. Months later, you wake in a Cairo hospital, your body broken and rebuilt by the surgeon's blade. The fever that nearly killed you has passed, but something essential has been taken forever. You are no longer whole. You are no longer entirely human in the eyes of those who will own you. Yet somehow, miraculously, you have survived what most do not. Now, decades later, you stand in the silk-draped corridors of Topkapi Palace. Your robes shimmer with gold thread worth more than entire villages. Viziers bow as you pass. The Sultan himself seeks your counsel before making decisions that will reshape empires. You control access to the most powerful man on earth, and through him, you control the destiny of millions. You have become what the Ottomans called the Kızlar Ayasu, the chief Black Eunuch. The most mutilated man in the empire has become its most feared power broker. But how? How could victims of the cruelest slavery imaginable transform into kingmakers who shape the fate of 3 continents? How could men stripped of their manhood become the ultimate wielders of masculine power? Before we dive into this forgotten world of shadows and silk, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's incredible how we're connected across centuries by these dark tales of power and survival. The answer to this paradox lies hidden in the secret chambers of the Ottoman Harem, where nothing was as it seemed, and where the most powerless souls learned to become puppet masters pulling the strings of history itself. Picture the word harem, and your mind conjures images from 1,000 Western fantasies. Perfumed gardens where beautiful women lounge on silk cushions, waiting to pleasure some turbaned sultan. Orientalist paintings of nude figures beside marble fountains. The fevered dreams of European men who never set foot in an Ottoman palace. But you are standing in the real harem of Topkapi Palace in 1650 AD. And the reality is far more complex than any Western imagination could conceive. These chambers buzz not with sensuality, but with political intrigue that would make Machiavelli weep with envy. The women here are not passive playthings. They are mothers of princes, political actors in their own right, wielding influence that spans from Istanbul to Baghdad. The Sultan's mother, the Valide Sultan, commands more respect than most viziers. These women plot succession, manipulate policy, and determine which of their sons will inherit an empire that stretches across 3 continents. But between these powerful women and the outside world stands a barrier more impenetrable than stone walls or iron gates. The barrier is living flesh, dark skin wrapped in silk robes, carrying keys that unlock more than just doors. The Black Eunuchs are the guardians of this feminine empire within an empire, the bridge between the world of men and the world of women who birth future sultans. You watch them move through the corridors with practiced grace, their faces masks of serene authority. They speak in whispers that carry more weight than the shouts of generals. A raised eyebrow from the chief Black Eunuch can doom a vizier's career. A slight nod can elevate a concubine to the position of royal favorite. These men have become the living walls between public and private power, between the masculine world of government and war and the feminine world of birth and succession. They are neither fully men nor women, existing in a liminal space that makes them perfect intermediaries in a world where gender determines everything. But here's the cruel irony that makes their story so compelling. The very mutilation that was meant to make them powerless, to ensure they could never father dynasties of their own, became the source of their ultimate authority. Their inability to reproduce made them the perfect guardians of reproduction itself. The European ambassadors who occasionally glimpsed this world returned to their courts with tales that sounded like myths. They spoke of eunuch viziers who controlled vast fortunes, of mutilated slaves who dined at the Sultan's table, of African men who had somehow climbed from the bottom of the social hierarchy to its very peak. These observers struggled to comprehend what they were witnessing. How could a system that began with such cruelty produce such unexpected reversals of fortune? How could the Ottoman Empire trust its most sacred spaces to men who had been torn from their African homelands as children? To understand this paradox, you must forget everything you think you know about power, about masculinity, about the relationship between victim and ruler. Because in the world of the Ottoman harem, traditional hierarchies were turned upside down, and the men who had lost everything found ways to gain everything else. To see how these men ascended from the depths of human misery to the heights of political power, we have to follow the blood trails of empire back to the slave markets of Africa where their impossible journey began. You are following a slave caravan across the burning sands of the Nubian desert in 1600 AD. The chain around your ankle cuts into flesh already raw from weeks of walking. Ahead of you, behind you, dozens of other boys stumble through the endless heat, their eyes hollow with the knowledge that they will never see home again. This caravan is part of a network that stretches from the heart of Africa to the slave markets of Cairo and beyond. You are valuable cargo, but not for the reasons you might think. Your youth, your health, your dark skin, these mark you as perfect raw material for one of the most specialized and horrific trades in human history. The slavers eye you with the calculating gaze of merchants evaluating livestock. They see profit walking on two legs, not just any profit, but the extraordinary wealth that comes from creating that rarest of commodities. The palace eunuch. You represent an investment that could return 1,000 times its initial cost if you survive what comes next. The journey to Cairo is a death march disguised as commerce. Of every 10 boys who begin this trek, perhaps 3 will reach the slave markets alive. Disease, exhaustion, and despair claim the rest. But those who survive this initial test have proven something valuable. They possess the physical and mental resilience that palace life will demand. In Cairo's slave markets, you are sorted like grain. The tall, the handsome, the intelligent, these are set aside for special treatment. A surgeon examines you with professional detachment, checking for defects that might make the coming operation impossible. This examination determines not just your fate, but your very survival. Why black eunuchs, you might wonder? The Ottomans had been using white eunuchs for centuries, castrated boys from the Caucasus and the Balkans who served in the palace schools and administrative ranks. But for the harem, darker skin was preferred, and the reason reveals the brutal logic of empire. Black eunuchs could never blend into the general population. Their African features marked them as foreign, as other, as belonging entirely to the palace system that had created them. They could never disappear into Turkish society, never build independent power bases, never pose the same threat that white eunuchs might present to the established order. The operation itself was a form of ritualized torture, disguised as medical procedure. In the steaming heat of Cairo's surgical chambers, boys were held down, while surgeons removed not just their capacity for reproduction, but often their entire masculine anatomy. The survival rate hovered around 30%. For every eunuch who eventually reached Istanbul, 2 had died screaming in these makeshift hospitals. But here's the perverse mathematics of this trade. The high mortality rate only increased the value of survivors. Each eunuch represented not just his own purchase price, but the cost of the 2 or 3 boys who had died to create him. By the time a black eunuch reached the Ottoman court, he was already worth a small fortune. Those who survived the surgeon's knife faced months of recovery in conditions that would test the limits of human endurance. Locked in rooms that reeked of infection and death, tended by other survivors who had become nurses out of necessity, these boys learned their first lesson in palace politics. Survival depended on helping each other survive. The psychological transformation was as profound as the physical one. Boys who had once dreamed of becoming warriors, fathers, leaders of their communities, now faced a future where traditional masculinity was impossible. They had to rebuild their identities from nothing, constructing new forms of self-worth that didn't depend on the biological functions they had lost. Some went mad. Some simply gave up and died despite surviving the operation. But others, the ones who would eventually stand in silk robes giving orders to viziers, discovered something unexpected in their mutilation, a strange form of freedom. They could never father dynasties, never build power through family connections, never threaten the Sultan through biological succession. This made them, paradoxically, more trustworthy than whole men. The very completeness of their loss became the foundation of their eventual gain. The journey from Cairo to Istanbul was the final stage of their transformation from African boys to Ottoman eunuchs. Packed into the holds of ships or the backs of caravans, they traveled north toward a destiny that none could have imagined when they first felt the slavers' chains. By the time they glimpsed the minarets of Istanbul rising from the Bosphorus, they were no longer the children who had been stolen from Nubian villages. They were something new, something that existed nowhere else in the world. Victims who had been forged into instruments of power, men who had lost their manhood only to gain a different kind of masculine authority. But in the palace, they would discover that their trials had only just begun, because the Ottoman court already had its own hierarchy of eunuchs, and the newcomers would have to fight for every scrap of influence in a world where white eunuchs had ruled for centuries. You enter the Ottoman palace system in 1620 AD, and immediately sense the tension crackling through the marble corridors like electricity before a storm. The palace eunuchs are not united brothers in mutilation. They are rivals, locked in a centuries-long struggle for influence, and the fault line runs along the color of their skin. the white eunuchs arrived first. Caucasians and Balkan boys recruited through the Devshirme system that transformed Christian children into Muslim servants of the state. They controlled the prestigious palace schools, where future administrators learned statecraft. They managed the outer courts, the treasury, the Sultan's personal household. For 3 centuries, they had been the undisputed masters of palace bureaucracy. These white eunuchs, called the Kapı Ağası, or gatekeepers, saw themselves as the true inheritors of Ottoman administrative tradition. They spoke Ottoman Turkish with aristocratic accents, understood the subtle protocols of court life, and moved through the halls of power with the confidence of men who belonged there. But you, arriving as a black eunuch, represent something that threatens their monopoly on influence. Your destination is not the administrative offices or the palace schools. You are bound for the harem, the one space in the palace that white eunuchs cannot enter. The feminine heart of imperial power where the sultan's mothers and wives shaped the succession of empires. The rivalry between white and black eunuchs was more than professional jealousy. It was a clash between 2 different visions of how the Ottoman system should work. White eunuchs believed in bureaucratic order, in written rules and established procedures. They saw themselves as guardians of administrative tradition. Black eunuchs operated in a world of personal relationships, of whispered conversations and emotional manipulation. They understood that in the harem, written law mattered less than knowing which concubine was pregnant, which prince was favored by his mother, which alliance could determine the next sultan's identity. The white eunuchs controlled money, but black eunuchs controlled something more valuable: access to the sultan's private life. While the Kapı Ağası managed official audiences and formal ceremonies, the Kızlar Ağası, the chief black eunuch, stood beside the sultan's bed at dawn, whispered in his ear during private moments, and shaped policy through intimate conversation rather than formal counsel. This created a parallel power structure that drove the white eunuchs to distraction. They would spend months preparing elaborate policy proposals, only to watch them overturned by a casual comment the chief black eunuch made during the sultan's morning prayers. They controlled the official channels of communication, but black eunuchs controlled the unofficial ones that often mattered more. The competition intensified during succession crises, when the death of a sultan could reshape the entire palace hierarchy. White eunuchs backed candidates based on administrative competence and political stability. Black eunuchs supported princes whose mothers had cultivated relationships within the harem, whose wet nurses had been carefully chosen, whose early education had been shaped by feminine influence. More often than not, the black eunuchs' candidates won, not because they were better rulers, but because the black eunuchs understood something their white counterparts missed. In the Ottoman system, the hand that rocked the cradle truly ruled the world. The white eunuchs watched in growing frustration as their African rivals accumulated wealth and influence that surpassed their own. A chief black eunuch could amass a personal fortune that dwarfed the salaries of grand viziers. He could endow mosques, fund public works, and dispense charity on a scale that made him a power in his own right. By the 17th century, the hierarchy was clear. The chief black eunuch ranked as the 3rd most important official in the empire after the Grand Vizier and the Grand Mufti. The white eunuchs, despite their longer tradition and administrative expertise, had been relegated to secondary status in their own palace. The psychological impact of this reversal was profound. White eunuchs had always been able to console themselves with the knowledge that despite their mutilation, they remained part of the imperial elite. They were Ottoman administrators, civilized servants of a great empire. But watching African slaves surpass them in wealth and influence challenged their fundamental understanding of how the world worked. Some white eunuchs tried to compete by developing their own networks within the harem, cultivating relationships with minor concubines or elderly women who remembered previous reigns. But they were always outsiders in that feminine world, tourists in a country where black eunuchs were natural citizens. The rivalry created its own form of palace entertainment. Courtiers would watch the subtle warfare between white and black factions, betting on which side would gain advantage during policy debates or succession crises. The Sultan himself sometimes played one faction against another, using their competition to prevent either group from becoming too powerful. But by the mid-17th century, it was clear which side was winning. The black eunuchs had not just equaled their white counterparts, they had crushed every rival, even the viziers who nominally outranked them. The men who had entered the palace as the most powerless beings in the empire had somehow climbed to its very pinnacle, leaving their former superiors bewildered in their wake. You wake before dawn in your chambers within Topkapi Palace, the year 1680 AD. As Kızlar Ağası, chief black eunuch, your day begins while Istanbul still sleeps. The massive golden keys hang from chains around your waist, each one opening doors that no other man in the empire may pass through. These keys don't just unlock rooms, they unlock the future of dynasties. Your first inspection reveals the complexity of the empire you actually rule. 400 women live in these chambers, from the Sultan's mother to the newest girls from Circassian slave markets. Each represents a potential alliance, a possible threat, a future opportunity. The newest concubines curtsy with desperate hope. The older women nod with respectful wariness of another master of the game. But it is the Valide Sultan who commands your deepest attention. When she turns from her window overlooking the Golden Horn, you see reflected in her eyes the same hunger for control that burns in your own. Together, you will decide not just who shares the Sultan's bed tonight, but who will inherit 3 continents tomorrow. The Sultan wishes to visit his newest concubine. You decide when, where, and how. A provincial governor seeks audience. He must first convince you his request deserves the Sultan's attention. Even the Grand Vizier must wait for your approval. This is not ceremonial gatekeeping, this is the machinery of imperial power, and you are its chief engineer. Your administrative duties would overwhelm a Grand Vizier. You manage appointments for thousands of palace servants. Each position representing profit as candidates offer bribes that could fund small armies. The religious endowments, the Waqf properties, represent your most sophisticated power source. As overseer of charitable foundations across the empire, you control vast estates from Budapest to Basra. European visitors struggle to comprehend your wealth. Here is a man who was once literally property, now dispensing patronage that rivals crowned heads of Europe. Your former chains have been transformed into golden threads that bind the loyalty of thousands. The morning brings supplicants to your reception hall, provincial governors bearing gifts, foreign merchants seeking privileges, military commanders requesting profitable posts. Each understands the unspoken rules. Your recommendation opens any door in the empire, your displeasure closes them forever. But your most crucial power lies in educating the Sultan's sons. As princes grow from infancy to adolescence, you shape their understanding of governance, religion, and imperial duty. You choose their tutors, design their curricula, determine which ideas fill their minds during their most impressionable years. When one becomes Sultan, he will rule an empire, but his worldview will have been crafted by your hands. You are not just serving the current ruler, you are creating future ones in your own image. The irony penetrates your existence. You, who can never father children, have become the ultimate father figure to boys who will lead the Islamic world. Your inability to create biological dynasties has made you architect of political ones. The mutilation meant to ensure powerlessness has become the foundation of absolute authority. By midday, you hold private audience with the Sultan himself. You speak in the subtle language of the Harem, where direct advice is never given but influence flows through carefully crafted suggestions. You are the lens through which he sees his empire, the filter through which all intelligence reaches his ears. Foreign ambassadors report back with bewilderment and fear. How can an empire function when such crucial decisions are influenced by a former slave? What they fail to understand is that your very marginality has become your strength. You belong to no traditional power structure, owe allegiance to no ancient family. As evening arrives, you manage the Sultan's private life with diplomatic precision. Which wife will share his bed? Which concubine deserves reward for loyalty? The woman you favor tonight might bear the next Sultan. The alliance you encourage could determine foreign policy for decades. You are no longer the terrified child dragged from his African village. You have become something unprecedented, a shadow prime minister who rules through intimacy rather than authority, who commands through service rather than force. You are living proof that the greatest weakness can be transformed into ultimate strength. He wasn't just a servant, he was the shadow prime minister of the most powerful empire on earth. You stand in Kösem Sultan's private chambers in 1623 AD, watching the most powerful woman in the Ottoman Empire pace before windows overlooking 3 continents. As chief Black Eunuch, you have served multiple sultans, but Kösem is different. She intends to be a ruler herself, and in you, she has found the perfect partner, a man whose rise from slavery mirrors her transformation from Greek concubine to imperial puppet master. The alliance between Valide Sultan and Kızlar Arsu represents history's most effective power-sharing arrangement. She provides legitimacy of royal blood and maternal authority. You provide administrative machinery and the keys to imperial control. Together, you form a partnership that can make or break sultans themselves. Kösem turns from the window, cold calculation in her eyes that has kept her alive through 6 different reigns. She speaks in your shared language of careful phrases that sound like advice but carry the force of commands. The Sultan seems troubled by the Janissary complaints, she observes. Translation: Our bribes to the military elite are insufficient. We need new funding sources before rebellion. Your coded response: Perhaps His Majesty would benefit from consulting provincial revenue ledgers. Meaning, we should divert funds from distant territories to buy loyalty closer to home, and you've already identified which governors can be safely robbed. This conversation, like dozens conducted weekly, will reshape imperial policy without appearing on any official record. The Sultan believes he receives maternal wisdom and trusted counsel. In reality, he implements decisions made by a partnership he barely comprehends. The power triangle governing the Ottoman Empire: the Sultan, nominally supreme but practically dependent; his mother, wielding influence through maternal authority; and you, controlling access while managing palace machinery. But increasingly, the Sultan occupies the weakest position in this arrangement. Qasem has already orchestrated one sultan's deposition, her own son, Osman II, when his policies threatened her network. She elevated younger son Murad IV, only to find herself managing his mental instability and violent tendencies. Now she maintains control while appearing to submit to masculine authority. Your role in these maneuvers is crucial but hidden. As the Sultan's closest male confidant, you plant ideas Qasem cannot suggest directly. A casual observation about provincial unrest redirects his military focus. Comments about religious endowment needs shift spending toward projects benefiting your shared political network. But the partnership extends beyond policy coordination into genuine friendship. Both have risen from complete powerlessness to heights that would have been impossible in original circumstances. Both understand the constant vigilance required to maintain authority through manipulation rather than force. In quiet moments, you speak with frank honesty of fellow survivors. She describes terror of early years as teenage concubine, never knowing if each night might be her last. You share memories of surgical chambers in Cairo, desperate struggle to rebuild identity after losing biological foundation of masculine selfhood. This emotional connection makes political partnership even more effective. You anticipate each other's needs with sibling intuition. When Qasem needs intelligence from the Sultan's private conversations, you provide reports that seem focused on external threats, while revealing internal anxieties driving imperial decisions. The financial dimensions create a parallel economy within the imperial system. Qasem's treasury control, combined with your management of religious endowments and appointment bribes, generates cash flows exceeding most European kingdoms. This wealth funds loyalty networks spanning the empire. But your most sophisticated collaboration involves educating future sultans. Qasem's maternal authority provides access to royal children during formative years, while your administrative control shapes formal education and tutor selection. Together, you create princes who will rule according to principles you've instilled. The succession crisis of 1640 represents the ultimate test of your alliance. When Sultan Ibrahim's mental instability becomes impossible to hide, Qasem supports his deposition for 7-year-old son Mehmed IV. This requires orchestrating a palace coup that removes a reigning sultan while preserving legitimate succession. Your role reveals the partnership's true power. While Qasem negotiates with Janissary commanders and governors, you manage palace logistics of revolution. You ensure loyal eunuchs control key passages, coordinate harem support, arrange the new sultan's physical safety. The coup's success establishes precedent reshaping Ottoman politics for generations. It demonstrates that Queen Mother and Chief Eunuch, acting together, can override even fundamental principles of sultanic authority. The harem has become not just a source of influence, but a power center controlling the system entirely. As young Mehmed IV begins his reign under your joint regency, it becomes clear that he occupies the weakest position in the power triangle actually governing his empire. You are Bashir Aga, Chief Black Eunuch, from 1717 to 1746 AD, and you have achieved the impossible. You have become more powerful than the Sultan himself. Your morning correspondence includes tribute from Egyptian governors, requests from Venetian merchants, and intelligence from agents in Vienna. These documents represent just a fraction of the network you've built during 3 decades as shadow ruler of the Islamic world. Sultan Mahmud I is a weak man who prefers poetry to policy, gardens to governance. This suits your purposes perfectly. Strong sultans create complications with inconvenient questions and dangerous ambitions. Weak ones provide ideal conditions for eunuch rule legitimacy without interference. Your daily routine reveals shadow government at its most sophisticated. Before dawn, intelligence briefings from agents throughout the empire and beyond. By sunrise, decisions affecting millions, which rebellion deserves military attention. Which trade route needs security? Which ambassador gets an audience? The Sultan begins his day seeking your counsel, believing he consults a trusted advisor while actually receiving instructions from his true ruler. Your humble recommendations carry the force of imperial commands. When you observe that His Majesty might consider a policy, everyone understands implementation is not optional. Your control over appointments has created a government staffed entirely by your creatures. From Grand Vizier to provincial tax collectors, Ottoman officials owe positions to your favor. This patronage system generates loyalty more reliable than any traditional hierarchy based on birth or military achievement. The bribes flowing through your chambers represent one of the empire's largest revenue streams. Foreign merchants pay handsomely for trading privileges. Provincial governors offer substantial gifts for favorable reports. Military commanders compete to provide tribute from conquests. But your most sophisticated power lies in managing religious endowments. As Waqf overseer, you control property holdings, generating revenues exceeding most European kingdoms. These foundations fund everything from Istanbul soup kitchens to Damascus schools to Danube bridges. European travelers witnessing your wealth describe scenes challenging their understanding of social hierarchy. A former slave dining from golden plates, wearing robes worth more than warships, receiving homage from men whose ancestors ruled kingdoms when your homeland was considered civilization's edge. The true measure of your power lies in shaping the empire's future through education. Princes who will one day rule spend formative years under your guidance, absorbing lessons carefully designed to ensure future dependence on eunuch administration. You personally select tutors for mathematics, theology, literature, statecraft. More importantly, you choose servants attending daily routines, guards protecting adolescent years, advisors whispering during uncertainty. When these princes ascend the throne, their understanding of governance will have been shaped entirely by your curriculum. Your informant network makes you better informed than any sultan in Ottoman history. Provincial administrators report directly, bypassing traditional channels. Military commanders share intelligence about enemy movements. Foreign merchants provide economic data about trade patterns. This information advantage allows anticipating problems before they become crises. When drought threatens Egyptian harvests, you have alternative grain supplies arranged. When European powers prepare militarily, you've already positioned Ottoman forces to respond. Your relationship with foreign powers reveals authority bypassing traditional diplomatic channels. European ambassadors quickly learn that treaties with the Grand Vizier are meaningless without your approval. Commercial agreements can be overturned by a single word from your chambers. Shadow diplomacy allows pursuing personal interests while maintaining sultanic fiction. Habsburg bribes find your treasury, while official policy remains unchanged. French agents seeking Ottoman support understand your backing matters more than formal alliances. Religious legitimacy provides protection against challenges. Generous mosque, school, and charity funding creates religious scholars viewing eunuch rule as divinely blessed. These clerics produce theological treatises justifying eunuch authority as consistent with Islamic tradition. Your janissary influence represents your most crucial achievement. These elite units, traditionally dangerous palace opposition, have been transformed into personal enforcers through generous payments, strategic appointments, and managed privileges. Commanders owe positions to your recommendations. Troops receive bonuses from your networks. Families benefit from your foundations. As your power reaches its zenith during the 1730s, you achieve something unprecedented in Islamic history. You become a ruler without a throne, a king without a crown, an emperor whose authority depends entirely on making others believe in your indispensability. The hand that opened the Sultan's door could also close his reign, and everyone in the empire understood that your fingers held the keys to their futures. You are a Venetian ambassador, arriving at Topkapi Palace in 1735 AD, and what you witness challenges every assumption your European mind holds about power, hierarchy, and the natural order of human society. The man who rises to greet you is tall, dignified, wearing robes that shimmer with threads of gold and silver. His dark skin gleams in the afternoon light filtering through latticed windows, and when he speaks, his voice carries the quiet authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. This is Bashir Aga, and according to your intelligence briefings, he is technically a slave. Yet provincial governors bow when he enters rooms. Cabinet ministers seek his approval before implementing policy. The Sultan himself defers to his council on matters of state. Your European understanding of social order simply cannot process this contradiction. You return to Venice with reports that your superiors dismiss as Oriental fantasy. A castrated African slave who rules an empire through whispered suggestions and careful manipulation. It sounds like the fevered dream of someone who has spent too long breathing the exotic airs of Constantinople. Yet you have witnessed it with your own eyes, and the memory haunts your understanding of how power actually functions in the world. European travelers who encounter the chief Black Eunuchs struggle to find language adequate to describe what they observe. Their letters home read like accounts of encounters with supernatural beings rather than political officials. They describe men who seem to possess magical authority over everyone around them, who can reshape imperial policy with casual observations, who accumulate wealth that exceeds royal treasuries through means that remain mysteriously invisible. The rumors that spread through European courts transform these observations into something approaching mythology. French diplomats whisper about African sorcerers who control Ottoman sultans through dark magic, learned in the deepest regions of their mysterious continent. Austrian intelligence reports describe eunuch conspiracies that span decades, with former slaves patiently implementing long-term plans to seize control of the Islamic world. British merchants returning from Istanbul tell stories in London coffeehouses that sound like Oriental tales from the Arabian Nights. They describe palaces within palaces where mutilated men live like princes, where former slaves dine from golden plates while their former masters serve them with elaborate ceremony, where the natural hierarchies of race and class have been turned completely upside down. These accounts feed growing European anxieties about the stability of their own social systems. If slaves can become rulers in the Ottoman Empire, what prevents similar reversals in Christian kingdoms? If castration can somehow become a pathway to power rather than punishment, what other assumptions about masculinity and authority might prove false? The religious dimension of European fear focuses particularly on the theological implications of eunuch rule. Catholic theologians struggle to reconcile their understanding of divine hierarchy with reports of mutilated men wielding authority over intact Christian populations within Ottoman territories. How can God permit such violations of natural order? What does eunuch success suggest about the relative strength of Islamic and Christian civilizations? Protestant observers find different sources of anxiety in the eunuch phenomenon. Their emphasis on individual salvation and direct relationship with divine authority makes them particularly troubled by reports of intermediaries who gain power through suffering and sacrifice. The idea that mutilation might somehow bring one closer to spiritual authority challenges fundamental assumptions about the relationship between physical wholeness and divine favor. The racial fears embedded in European responses to eunuch power reveal the deep anxieties that colonial expansion has created in European minds. Here are Africans, people whom European slave traders routinely brutalize and dehumanize, demonstrating intellectual and political capabilities that surpass those of their supposed civilizational superiors. The success of Black Eunuchs forces uncomfortable questions about the justifications used to support European exploitation of African populations. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of European reactions involves the gender implications of eunuch authority. These are men who have been stripped of traditional masculine identity, yet they wield power more effectively than any intact European ruler. Their success suggests that conventional understanding of masculine authority might be fundamentally flawed, that political effectiveness might not depend on the biological functions that European culture associates with male dominance. French court ladies, hearing accounts of eunuch wealth and influence, begin to fantasize about similar arrangements that might free them from the constraints of European patriarchy. What if mutilation could somehow liberate men from the competitive drives that make them unreliable political partners? What if the removal of sexual desire could create a new form of masculine authority based on rational calculation rather than emotional impulse? These fantasies horrify French men, who recognize the implicit critique of their own political competence. If castrated Africans can rule empires more effectively than European kings, what does this suggest about the value of intact European masculinity? The success of Ottoman eunuchs becomes, paradoxically, an attack on European male self-confidence that generates defensive responses ranging from dismissive ridicule to genuine terror. German philosophers, encountering reports of eunuch power through diplomatic correspondence, attempt to develop theoretical frameworks that can explain this apparent violation of natural law. They propose elaborate theories about climate and race that might account for the success of African eunuchs in Oriental contexts, while preserving European confidence in their own civilizational superiority. But these intellectual exercises cannot entirely suppress the disturbing implications of what European observers are witnessing. If social hierarchy is truly natural and divinely ordained, how can former slaves rise to positions that exceed those of born aristocrats? If masculine authority depends on biological completeness, how can castrated men demonstrate superior political abilities? The artistic representations of eunuch power that begin appearing in European courts reveal the psychological impact of these encounters. Paintings depict black eunuchs as almost supernatural figures, surrounded by symbols of wealth and authority that seem to glow with otherworldly power. These images transform political reality into Orientalist fantasy, making eunuch success appear magical rather than strategic. Yet, beneath the exotic imagery, European artists struggle to convey something genuinely unsettling about what they have learned concerning Ottoman power structures. Their paintings often include subtle details that suggest deeper anxieties. European figures cowering before eunuch authority, traditional symbols of masculine power rendered useless by eunuch influence, religious imagery that seems to validate rather than condemn these apparent violations of natural order. The economic reports that European merchants bring back from Ottoman territories provide the most concrete evidence of eunuch power, but also the most challenging data for European theorists to explain. How can former slaves accumulate wealth that exceeds royal treasuries? How can men without biological heirs create economic empires that span generations? How can political systems based on personal loyalty prove more efficient than European bureaucracies based on legal tradition? These questions force European observers to confront uncomfortable truths about the limitations of their own political systems. Perhaps birth and blood matter less than intelligence and strategic thinking. Perhaps traditional masculine virtues of aggression and competition actually hinder effective governance. Perhaps the social hierarchies that Europeans consider natural and inevitable are actually arbitrary constructions that can be rebuilt according to different principles. The fear these realizations generate helps explain the intensity of European hostility toward Ottoman power during this period. Military campaigns against the empire become not just territorial conflicts, but civilizational struggles to preserve European confidence in their own social systems. The success of eunuch rule represents an existential threat to European self-understanding that demands violent response. But the most profound European fear involves the possibility that eunuch success might not be unique to Ottoman circumstances. What if similar transformations could occur within European societies? What if the hierarchies that seem so stable and natural could be overturned by individuals with sufficient intelligence and determination? What if power really does flow to those best equipped to manage it, regardless of their biological or social origins? As reports of eunuch influence continue reaching European capitals throughout the 18th century, this anxiety only intensifies. Outsiders feared them for their apparent violation of natural law, but increasingly, insiders feared them even more, as they recognized that traditional sources of authority were proving helpless against the quiet revolution that castrated African slaves had unleashed within the heart of Islamic civilization. You are examining the account books in your private treasury in 1740 AD, and the figures written in gold ink tell a story that would astonish even the wealthiest merchants of Venice or Amsterdam. As chief black eunuch, your personal fortune has grown beyond the dreams of sultans, built not through conquest or inheritance, but through the patient accumulation of religious charity transformed into political capital. The system that has made you rich operates through one of Islam's most sacred institutions, the Waqf, religious endowments that fund charitable works throughout the empire. What began as pious donations from wealthy believers has become the foundation of an economic empire that spans 3 continents and generates revenues that rival the treasuries of European kingdoms. Your morning begins with reports from property managers scattered across the Ottoman domains. From the bustling bazaars of Cairo to the fertile farms of Anatolia, from the spice warehouses of Baghdad to the silk workshops of Bursa, thousands of properties generate income that flows directly into your coffers under the pretense of religious administration. The beautiful irony of your wealth lies in its source. Charity intended to serve God has become the mechanism through which you serve yourself. Devout Muslims donate properties to religious foundations believing they are securing their passage to paradise. Instead, they are funding your rise to earthly power that exceeds anything their prayers might have imagined. Each Waqf under your control represents a carefully constructed financial instrument disguised as religious devotion. A wealthy merchant dies and leaves his textile workshop to fund a neighborhood mosque. You ensure that mosque is built, employing architects and laborers who owe their positions to your patronage. But the workshop continues operating under your management, its profits theoretically dedicated to maintaining religious services, but practically available for your personal use. The scale of this system defies European comprehension. Your endowments fund over 300 mosques across the empire, each requiring ongoing maintenance that justifies permanent revenue streams. You oversee 47 schools where thousands of students study theology and law, their education funded by commercial properties whose management requires constant oversight and substantial administrative fees. The soup kitchens you operate feed tens of thousands of Istanbul's poor daily, a charitable work that generates enormous public goodwill while creating opportunities for profitable contracts with food suppliers, equipment manufacturers, and construction companies. Every bowl of soup distributed in your name represents both genuine charity and sophisticated financial engineering. But perhaps your most brilliant innovation involves the pilgrimage trade. As overseer of endowments that support travelers to Mecca, you control the infrastructure of Islamic religious obligation. The caravanserais where pilgrims rest, the guides who lead them through desert routes, the ships that carry them across the Red Sea, all operate under your management and generate profits that accumulate in your personal accounts. Your network of religious foundations creates employment for thousands of administrators, guards, maintenance workers, and religious officials. Each position represents an opportunity to extract loyalty through patronage and profit through carefully managed inefficiency. The man you appoint to oversee a mosque's daily operations will always find reasons to request additional funding for urgent repairs or expanded services. The international dimensions of your economic empire extend far beyond Ottoman territories. Your agents operate in India, purchasing luxury goods that flow westward through trade routes you partially control. Your investments in North African gold mines generate precious metals that find their way into European markets through networks you have carefully cultivated over decades. European merchants seeking access to Ottoman markets quickly learn that success depends more on your approval than any official trade agreements. A single recommendation from your office can open doors throughout the empire, while your displeasure can close profitable opportunities faster than military blockades. This influence translates into consultation fees, partnership opportunities, and investment returns that multiply your wealth exponentially. The religious legitimacy that protects your economic activities makes them virtually unassailable by traditional political opposition. Critics who might challenge your accumulation of personal wealth face the uncomfortable necessity of attacking charitable institutions that feed the poor, educate children, and maintain houses of worship. Your greed hides behind genuine piety in ways that make exposure politically impossible. Your private chambers display wealth that would make European royalty envious. Persian carpets, whose value could purchase entire villages, cover floors inlaid with precious woods from forests spanning from Morocco to Malaysia. The walls gleam with calligraphy executed in gold and silver by the finest artists of the Islamic world. Verses from the Quran that celebrate charity and devotion while surrounding luxury that exceeds imperial standards. But the true measure of your economic power lies not in personal display, but in your ability to fund political projects that extend your influence throughout the empire. The provincial governors you have purchased through strategic loans remain loyal because they cannot afford to repay your generosity. The military commanders whose careers you have advanced through timely financial support understand that their continued success depends on your continued favor. Your charitable activities create constituencies that span across social classes and geographic regions. The poor who eat at your soup kitchens, the students who attend your schools, the pilgrims who benefit from your travel infrastructure, the merchants who profit from your commercial networks, all have reasons to support your continued authority and oppose any attempts to restrict your power. The intellectual justification for your wealth comes from Islamic scholars whose own positions depend on your patronage. They produce theological treatises that explain how your accumulation of resources serves divine purposes by enabling greater charitable works. These learned men develop sophisticated arguments about how personal enrichment becomes religiously meritorious when it increases one's capacity to serve community needs. Foreign intelligence services attempting to understand Ottoman financial systems struggle to comprehend the complexity of your economic arrangements. Traditional European models of wealth accumulation through land ownership or military conquest cannot explain how a former slave has assembled commercial networks that generate revenues exceeding those of hereditary aristocrats. The accounting methods you employ, combine legitimate bookkeeping with creative interpretation that would impress modern corporate strategists. Revenue from commercial properties appears as donations to religious causes. Profits from trading ventures are recorded as surpluses from charitable operations. Personal expenses become administrative costs for managing endowments that serve public purposes. Your financial advisors, drawn from the most sophisticated commercial families of the empire, manage investment portfolios that span industries and continents. Your money flows into textile manufacturing, precious metal trading, agricultural development, shipping operations, and early industrial ventures that will reshape the economy of the Islamic world. As you review the quarterly reports that detail your economic empire's performance, the numbers tell a story that transcends individual enrichment. Your wealth represents the transformation of religious obligation into political power, the conversion of charitable intention into personal authority, the alchemy by which spiritual currency becomes temporal influence. The system you have perfected will outlast your own lifetime, creating precedents that future generations of eunuchs will follow and expand. Your economic innovations have demonstrated that in the right circumstances, powerlessness can be transformed into wealth. Marginalization can become the foundation of influence, and religious devotion can serve secular ambition. They began as mutilated slaves torn from African villages, but they died as millionaires whose wealth rivaled sultans and whose economic influence shaped the destiny of empires. You are standing in the same chambers where Bashir Agha once commanded an empire, but the year is 1846 AD, and everything has changed. The silk hangings still gleam with gold thread, the Persian carpets still cover marble floors, but the streams of supplicants have dwindled to a trickle. The keys that once opened every door in the Ottoman Empire now unlock rooms that fewer people care to enter. The reform edicts of Sultan Mahmud II have begun reshaping the empire according to European models of government and administration. The traditional palace system that had elevated eunuchs to positions of supreme authority is being dismantled piece by piece, replaced by bureaucratic structures that value written law over personal relationship, official rank over intimate access. You watch from your windows as construction workers modify the palace courtyards, creating offices for ministries that will handle functions once managed through your private chambers. Foreign advisors, mostly French and British experts in modern government, stride through corridors where eunuchs once whispered policy into sultanic ears. Their blueprints and organizational charts represent a world where your kind of power cannot exist. The abolition of the slave trade has cut off the supply of new eunuchs that once fed the palace system. No more caravans arrive from Africa carrying boys destined for surgical transformation and decades of service. The existing population of palace eunuchs ages without replacement, becoming relics of a system that the reformed empire no longer needs or wants. Your daily routines, once filled with audiences and administrative decisions that affected millions, now consist largely of ceremonial duties and management of properties whose political significance has evaporated. The religious endowments you oversee continue generating revenue, but that wealth no longer translates into political influence when policy decisions are made in ministry offices rather than harem chambers. The European-trained administrators who staff the new governmental departments view you and your surviving colleagues with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. They see living fossils from an era of imperial dysfunction, examples of the Oriental despotism that modern reform is designed to eliminate. Your decades of experience in managing complex political relationships count for nothing in a system that values technical expertise over personal wisdom. The harem itself has been transformed from a center of political power into something more closely resembling the European fantasies that had always misunderstood its true function. The women who once shaped imperial policy through careful manipulation of sultanic psychology now find themselves reduced to purely domestic roles, their influence confined to private family matters rather than affairs of state. Young officers trained in European military academies look at you with barely concealed amusement, unable to comprehend how castrated slaves once commanded the respect of hardened warriors and experienced diplomats. Their modern understanding of masculinity and authority cannot process the psychological mechanisms that had made eunuch rule possible in the first place. The financial reforms that accompany political modernization have restructured the religious endowment system in ways that eliminate most opportunities for the kind of creative accounting that had built eunuch fortunes. Professional auditors, trained in European methods, review Waqf finances with clinical detachment, identifying irregularities that had once been considered normal administrative practices. Your network of provincial contacts carefully cultivated over decades of patronage and mutual obligation, has been disrupted by the appointment of governors selected through merit examinations rather than personal recommendation. These new administrators owe their positions to bureaucratic competence rather than eunuch favor, making them immune to the traditional methods of influence that had sustained your power. The telegraph lines that now connect Istanbul with distant provinces have eliminated one of your most crucial advantages: control over information flow between the capital and the periphery. Provincial governors can now communicate directly with ministry officers, bypassing the personal networks that had made eunuchs indispensable as intermediaries and intelligence gatherers. European diplomatic missions, once forced to negotiate through eunuch channels to reach effective decision-makers, now conduct their business through foreign ministry offices, staffed by Ottoman diplomats, trained in European capitals. Your exclusion from these discussions represents more than personal marginalization. It symbolizes the empire's rejection of the entire system that had elevated you to prominence. The new Sultan, Abdulmecid I, has been educated according to European principles of constitutional monarchy and rational administration. Unlike his predecessors, who had depended on eunuch counsel for understanding their empire's needs, he seeks advice from cabinet ministers and relies on written reports rather than whispered suggestions from intimate advisors. The military reforms that have modernized Ottoman armed forces have eliminated another traditional source of eunuch influence. The Janissary Corps, whose loyalty you and your predecessors had purchased through strategic bribes and patronage, has been dissolved and replaced by a European-style army whose officers serve the state rather than personal benefactors. Your surviving colleagues adapt to their diminished circumstances in different ways. Some retreat into religious contemplation, spending their remaining years in genuine devotion to the Islamic principles that had once served as convenient justification for worldly ambition. Others attempt to maintain relevance by offering their services as consultants to the new administrators, sharing decades of experience with men who have little interest in their outdated expertise. A few of the younger eunuchs, those who entered palace service during the final years of the traditional system, attempt to retrain themselves for positions in the reformed government. But their efforts are largely futile, as the skills that had made them effective in the old system, personal diplomacy, psychological manipulation, network management, have little application in bureaucracies designed to operate through impersonal procedures. The charitable institutions you continue to oversee provide some measure of ongoing purpose, but even these activities have been affected by modernizing reforms. Government ministries now coordinate social services that had once been managed through religious endowments, reducing the eunuch-controlled Waqf system to a secondary role in addressing social needs. The wealth you accumulated during the height of eunuch power provides some protection against complete irrelevance, but your riches cannot purchase the kind of influence they once commanded. Money that had once bought political loyalty now generates only personal comfort, a luxurious retirement, rather than continued authority. International observers who had once reported on eunuch power with fascination and fear now describe your decline with a mixture of satisfaction and anthropological interest. European newspapers celebrate the empire's modernization as evidence of Oriental civilization finally abandoning the barbaric practices that had characterized its traditional government. As you review the correspondence that still arrives in your chambers, the contrast with previous decades becomes painfully clear. Where once you received intelligence reports from across 3 continents, you now read mostly ceremonial greetings and requests for assistance with minor personal matters. Your transformation from shadow emperor to ceremonial figurehead mirrors the broader changes reshaping Ottoman society. The new generation of Ottoman elites, educated in European schools and committed to Western models of progress, view your entire era as an embarrassing chapter in imperial history that is best forgotten. They see eunuch rule as a symbol of the Oriental despotism and institutional corruption that modern reform is designed to eliminate forever. But your fall mirrored the empire's own collapse, as the very reforms that eliminated eunuch power also proved unable to arrest the Ottoman decline that would eventually lead to the empire's complete dissolution. You walk the halls of Topkapi Palace in 1924 AD. But now it is a museum rather than a seat of power. The empire has collapsed, the last sultan has fled, and the Turkish Republic has risen from its ashes. The chambers where eunuchs once whispered policy now display glass cases of relics, as silent as Babylon's ruins. European tourists see what they expect: evidence of Oriental despotism, sexual corruption, irrational governance that modern civilization has supposedly left behind. Their guidebooks dismiss the eunuch system as Islamic barbarity, a historical curiosity that confirms Western superiority. But Turkish visitors often feel something more complicated. These were men who endured the most extreme dehumanization, yet transformed victimhood into authority, powerlessness into influence, marginalization into centrality. The irony runs deeper than most realize. The men stripped of masculine identity became the ultimate wielders of masculine power. Those denied biological heirs became architects of dynasties that outlasted intact kings. In European memory, eunuchs symbolize everything wrong with Islamic civilization. Blurred lines between private and public power, rule by intimacy rather than law. But this forgets their effectiveness. At their peak, eunuchs gave the Ottoman world stability, while Europe was torn by civil wars, succession crises, and religious massacres. Race made the paradox sharper. Africans enslaved and mutilated by Europeans were, in Istanbul, commanding viziers, educating princes, and shaping the fate of continents. Western historians, uncomfortable with this contradiction, often reduce their rise to castration alone, as though mutilation, not intelligence and strategy, explained their rule. In Turkish memory, eunuchs remain ambiguous. To some, they are symbols of decadence, proof of an empire weakened by obsession with secrecy and control. To others, they are examples of resilience, men who rebuilt identities from nothing, who turned their supposed weakness into unmatched strength. Their greatest symbol may be their disappearance. Unlike other systems of slavery or exploitation, eunuch rule left almost no trace once modernization arrived. When supply routes closed and bureaucratic reforms swept away the palace system, their entire world evaporated. They vanished so completely that modern observers struggle to understand how they ever functioned at all. But that disappearance carries their final lesson. No matter how powerful or permanent it seems, survives forever. The eunuchs who turned loss into strength, who built empires from the wreckage of their own bodies, discovered that all authority is temporary. Today, tourists pause before their artifacts. Golden keys, silk robes, portraits of men whose faces combine dignity with sadness. These objects whisper of people who lost everything and gained everything, who were destroyed and remade, who found in their deepest humiliation the seeds of their greatest triumph. Their story resists easy judgment. Were they victims or oppressors, symbols of resilience or collaborators in corruption? Survivors who transcended categories, or enforcers of a system that exploited others as cruelly as it had exploited them? Perhaps the most honest way to remember them is, as they lived, contradictions that cannot be neatly resolved. Human beings who embodied both cruelty and possibility, who transformed catastrophe into power through methods as mysterious as they were effective. History remembers them as shadows in silk, men who lost everything but gained an empire, only to watch both their power and their world disappear into the relentless current of time, which spares no one, not even those who once seemed to master survival itself. The men forbidden to create life became the men who shaped empires. If you enjoyed this story, you'll also like the story of the most inbred man in European history. Watch it next.